Well, welcome to Questioning Christianity. My name's Dan Patterson, and this YouTube channel is really about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're not a Christian, if you're exploring, maybe if you're skeptical and have questions, you are totally welcome. Glad you're here. In this episode, we're going to be exploring how Christianity lands in the real world, picking up on politics, culture, and history. And my guest for this episode, John Anderson, is really well suited to be able to field all the hard questions that you may have in this area. John is a sixth-generation farmer here in Australia who turned politician in his 20s to spend nearly 2 decades in public office in Canberra, the last 6 years of which he spent as the leader of the National Party and as the Deputy Prime Minister under the John Howard government. Since stepping down from public office in 2005, John went back to farm life, but picked up public speaking to help younger generations think through the various questions and challenges that they're facing in the real world, looking at how Christianity adds some meaning and purpose to people's lives as well. John also started in the last 5 or 6 years an enormously successful YouTube channel and podcast called Conversations with John Anderson, where he's had the chance to throw questions to many of the most famous thinkers, secular and religious, alive today, to pick up on the questions that really do matter. So I am enormously thankful to be able to welcome him onto the channel. Well, John, it is my honor to welcome you onto our humble channel. Thanks for joining.
Dan, great to be with you. Good to see you.
So John Anderson is a father and a farmer and a husband and the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, and has an Order of Australia medal as a companion. You're a chairman of more boards than I probably have letters even in my resume over the years. And in these last 5 years, you've become a YouTube sensation with a channel that's now got over 500,000 subscribers and counting. John, could you let everyone, perhaps people who don't know you as well, kind of tell us a little bit about where it all began? What's the start of your story? Spell that out for us in a few minutes.
Well, I'm a fifth generation farmer on my father's side and sixth on my mother's from northwest New South Wales. Grew up out here as a kid, didn't go into a classroom until I was 9, then went to a local primary school by the week and used to come home on the weekends. Was sent to a boarding school in Sydney, which is where one night I asked my commerce teacher to explain what he believed as a Christian, and I came out believing. After university, I returned home to the farm and was asked some years later, in my later 20s, to run for federal parliament. And I did so after taking careful soundings. In 1989, in a by-election, I became a member of the House of Representatives and served there for nearly 2 decades. I left having not become addicted, I have to say, to public life, but having given it my best shot, and having had 10 years as nearly 10 years as a cabinet minister and exactly 6 as deputy PM, and thought I'd go farming again. Got involved in a couple of not-for-profits and have tried to make a contribution through that role. In more recent years, I have found a surprising demand for public speaking engagements, but also for, I think, 6 years this coming Easter, we've been running the podcast series. We've now, according to YouTube, achieved good enough for 150 million downloads. So there is an appetite for what we're trying to do, which is to bring top quality thinking through to watchers and listeners, or both, so that they can hear what those thinkers want to say without being interrupted. Our model is one of non-entrapment, no agendas, minimal interruption. I try only to interrupt if I think there's a point that needs emphasising. And I'm now a grandfather and a farm labourer on the side. I don't run my farm anymore, or our farm. My son and daughter-in-law run it.
Well, there's a lot to pick up on there, and particularly we'll get to the YouTube channel later in those conversations, which I'm really looking forward to. We'll make sure that the channel itself is linked in the show notes so people can find that, the Conversations with John Anderson. But I want to go back to the beginning of your story. I mean, some people kind of have the perception that when it comes to politicians who are polished in their presentation, that often they were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. But growing up on the farm, starting school at 9, it kind of paints a little bit of a different picture of some hardship that you've experienced as well. Can you talk us a little bit about how you think those experiences that you had growing up helped shape you for public life, and what role they would have played in leading you towards faith in Jesus?
Well, my mother died when I was very, very young. I'm very glad my father kept my sister and me with him, and we had initially a succession of governesses, they were called in those days, who looked after us and probably started our very early education. And one of my
Mm.
father's sisters came to help out for 3 weeks and stayed for 30 years. I owe her a great debt. She probably filled in the mother role. It was quite an isolated upbringing. I think that probably made me a bit insular. I probably, had to scramble a bit later in life to learn how to socialize and interact. Maybe I've never learnt very well. I don't know, but I do try. Um, uh, Boarding school, I neither enjoyed it nor didn't enjoy it. But I'm very glad that I went to the school that I did. Um, During those years, we had a terrible family accident where my sister was killed, which is what sobered me up and started making me ask very deep questions as I went to a place of great personal loneliness and one where I felt that no matter how nice people were and sympathetic they were, they didn't quite understand what I'd been through. And that was an enormously shaping experience and probably was the thing that led me to go and seek out from my then commerce teacher what he believed and why, as I was sort of looking for some sort of set of answers to the great dilemmas. Why suffering? Why me? Does anybody care? Does anybody understand? Will the pain ease? Will the wounds be bound up? Will I know joy?
Do you feel like there was the personal resources that you found then in the Christian story? So you talk about coming to believe what your teacher shared with you. What was it in what he shared that made you open towards God or drawn towards belief in Jesus?
It's a long time ago now, and I often look back on it and I think, my goodness, I thought of him as old and wise. He would have been 27. I was about 16. I cannot remember a word of what he said. All I know is that I came out of there absolutely convinced that Christianity was true and that I needed, therefore, to understand it. Unusual. I mean, I think people have many faith journeys, but mine
Mm.
was, I just came out just absolutely rock solid convinced that what he said was right and I needed to understand what it was about and
And
needed
have you
to
felt
learn.
like, yeah, sorry to interrupt. Have you felt like there was some answers then that you found in Jesus that speak to that longing for healing from that suffering and that pain and that opens you up to experience joy?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, John Lennox was somebody, people know he's the famous Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at Oxford. He just celebrated his 80th birthday, I think. But I saw a comment the other day, one of his fellow academics had said, no, surely you can't believe that Christianity explains anything. To which he replies, on the contrary, it explains everything. And
Mm.
that's where I sit as I hear people trying to explain things from a non-Christian perspective. And I'm not a scientist, but even the scientists, to me, it just seems so blindingly obvious that if you say it all began with a big bang, that the massive question still remains: who on earth was responsible for the Big Bang? How did it happen?
Mm.
It doesn't
Mm.
matter where you go to. The idea that it's all just an accident,
Mm.
that um, you know, it's impossible to me. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a scientist. I say that straight up front. But the idea that somehow or other, over eons of time, set laws and set procedures and so forth were set down in everything from DNA to the way the stars interact and all the rest of it. The reason, if you like, that is at the basis of science, the order that's at the basis of it, just seems preposterous to me that that could have been an
Mm.
accident.
Mm.
Seems preposterous to me that the wonder that is a human being, mind you, the glory and the scum were a mixture, but the idea that we could be an accident seems, again, preposterous to
Mm.
me. I know that
I
you
hear
have
that.
listeners who
Yeah,
have
and
a different perspective, but to me, it seems preposterous.
Yeah, and I think everyone has the intuitions that they come to these sorts of questions with, and it's one of the best things I think I've appreciated about your conversation series is how you put your ideas to the test by having conversations with people who don't think the same as you. And maybe we'll chat about Jonathan Haidt later and his work on that. But we have a common friend, Os Guinness, who's been a big mentor figure of mine, but also one of the most helpful people penning the role that Christian faith plays in the public square, at least the role that Christian faith can play at its best in the public square, particularly when it comes to political engagement. And I know you've read his work and engaged with Oz a lot over the years. What was it in your experience that drew you towards saying yes when someone said, John, you should run for a public office? What led you into politics?
Well, I'd love to talk a bit more about Oz because I think my favourite conversation of all was the second one that I posted with him about 12 or 18 months ago on our civilizational moment. And he does talk about the public square. It's worth remembering for those who haven't stopped to think what the public square is. It was once a physical place,
Mm,
the Areopolis, where people met and argued and thrashed out ideas. It was a square. It then morphed, if you like, over the years in our culture into the parliaments, then expanded by newspapers and then by radio, then by television. And now you have a virtual global public square because of social
mm,
media where debates are carried out. And he makes the point it can either be a naked public square where an authoritarian regime says there will be no belief system, think
mm,
communism or dictatorships, or it'll be a totally religious square where only one brand of religion is allowed, and that's just as repressive to the human spirit, or it can be a mixed public square where hopefully, with some degree of courtesy, we will swap ideas, we will argue even vigorously, but not personally and in a nasty way, as we try and find our way through the journey of life. And we ought to all be engaged in that. The famous, I think it was Socrates, was it not? The life unexamined is not worth living.
mm.
Uh, I find it amazing that some human beings are prepared to wander through life without asking any of the big questions because life's tough, life's difficult, we suffer. I mean, these are questions that we rightly often ponder, but we need to actually then keep pondering them until we've found some resolution. Now, sorry, what
Mm.
was the other part of the question?
Yeah, so
Uh,
what in terms of that vision drew you then towards politics? Was it that
Public
I've
life.
got particular political aspirations? Was it that I've got convictions around how I think policy should be developed? Was it that I've got a general sense of service based on my Christian faith to try and seek the
Um,
common good of my fellow Aussies? What was sort of your motivations?
all of the above and none of them. I was always interested in the public debate, always interested in good public policy, always profoundly Australian, always driven by the awareness that my father had fought in a horrendous conflict. People treated him differently. It was known that he'd been given up for dead. So people sort of, and he survived. And people used to treat him in a way that I think I was deeply conscious reflected a sort of reverence for someone they knew who'd put everything on the line.
Mm,
Um, and I was also aware of what a nightmare it had been for him because he'd sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night, reliving the moment when the German Panzer found the range when he was in the Middle East and shells started going off and he was hit. Um, uh, and So those things sort of came together in someone who was in his 20s through university and afterwards, probably a little too serious for his own good at times. I'm sure a lot of my critics would say that. Needed to loosen up a bit, maybe, I don't know. But was interested in these things. Had
mm,
never, ever considered in any way a political career until, as everybody in this area did at the time, I joined the local branch of the National Party. They wouldn't take no 12 months after I joined when the secretary wanted to retire. And I found myself as a young man being the secretary of a branch. And I thought, what do I do with this? And it drew me to the attention of a local member who, at the age of 27, rang me up one day and said, come and have a conversation. I thought, what on earth would the local federal member? My father knew him well. They'd played cricket before the war and even after the war, so forth. And I walked into his office. He was an older man. He looked up at me and I said, oh, Johnny. He said, nobody ever called me John then. I'm going to retire. I want you to have a go in my place. And I was flabbergasted. And so I suppose if you think of it in terms of giftings and callings, I don't know that I ever focused much on my gifts. Probably hadn't really.
mm,
Um, And I'd certainly not focused on that as a calling. I was enjoying being a farmer, having a go. I bought more country, expanding what I was trying to do, working for me anyway, quite hard. I thought I was. I hadn't considered this idea at all. It was very novel. I burst out of the blue. Life does that sometimes. I was talking to
Yeah.
some young people the other day, and I actually encourage them, get a handle on your gifts, help get other people to work through how they see your giftings. They're probably not as you think they are. Then don't be proud of them. Adopt the right attitude. Put them on the table and say they're really there for the benefit of other people. They're entrusted to you. They're not yours. You're not somehow clever because you're gifted or special because you're gifted. Just means that you have responsibilities, as I see it. And then the issue of calling, what can you do with those giftings? That isn't always easy, but in my case, it probably was, because somebody else asked me to have a go at something, and then to my enormous amazement, my genuine surprise, the 2 or 3 elder statesmen in my own community that I consulted, they said, "No, I've been asked to do this mad thing," and they all sort of said, "Well, Johnny, you better have a go."
Mm.
And I was a bit amazed by that, so I did, and that started the whole thing.
That itself, sort of the voice of elder statesmen, is something that almost seems to be in question in a lot of people's experience these days. It feels a little bit like a generational loss, that the disillusionment that many younger people have grown up when they look at certainly political figures, but more so with just key leader figures in their life often being exposed as something entirely other than what they profess to be publicly, or that just aren't really worthy of imitation. There's a real disillusionment with that sort of search for wisdom in older generations. What have you seen change, let's say, over the last 20, 30 years? Because you, when you left politics nearly 20 years ago now, were so well regarded on both sides of the aisle. I mean, Kim Beazley, the leader of the opposition, had tremendously kind things to say to you, but to think that happening in politics now is almost unthinkable, kind of the partisan nature that we've fallen into. What do you think needs to happen, given all the change that you've seen, to rebuild that social trust that there is such a thing as elder statesmen again?
It's a very good question. I think several things have happened. One is that life has been incredibly easy for Australians. And, the land of the endless summer, we always thought it would just go on. Doesn't mean that people are particularly happy in that state, but it's always been assumed that, you know, um, we don't have to make any hard decisions. We're somehow very fortunate, and everything will be all right and it'll work out in the end. That has been coupled with, their terminology, not mine, the left's insistence. This is an actual term coined by a left-wing activist in the 1950s in America. The long march through the institutions, which meant education in particular. Now, I'm a little biased because I studied history. I believe history, including the Bible, by the way, which is history, properly understood, is transformational. It brings the wisdom of the ages to the table. It means you don't have to discover everything for yourself, because you can't anyway. No other discipline better equips you, in my view, than a proper understanding of the wisdom of the ages uh, for life here, and I would say in the evermore. That's been washed out. History has been either not taught, or it's been used as a tool in pursuit of social agendas. And so you'll have this type of history and that type of history, and racist history and feminist history and all the rest of it, rather than the teaching of history as powerful events resulting from powerful thinking and producing powerful thinking and society changing norms and what have you, and then trying to come to grips with what they really mean as objectively as possible. That's been washed out of the system. And so this has been coupled with this sort of great move against our traditional beliefs at 2 levels, the Christian underpinning, but also a rejection of the things that we used to value as Australians. And that's all there in the literature and in the research. I mean, younger people do not have anything like the same regard for Western democratic traditions that older people do. They really don't. And the evidence is rapidly emerging. They're not returning to that sort of ballasted middle position as they move through life. in part because we no longer value family, and that's now being exacerbated by the cost of living and the cost of housing, which is delaying family formation. And one of the things about family formation, of course, is that just as Dan, when you were born, when I was born, people had to make way for us. They had to make sacrifices if they were any half decent parents at all, and recognise that it couldn't just be about them anymore. Uh, it's one of the great antidotes to selfishness, one of the great encouragers of society, society in the right sense of the word, that we live, in communion with others, is having your own family, your own children. And now that's happening less and less often. I don't know how many people know this, but Australia in the next decade will enter, it'll be one of the next nations to go into a depopulation bomb. We now know that many young people are deferring having children or not having them at all. And you hear stories of people saying, I'm going to have a vasectomy because I'm not going to bring kids into this terrible world, or I'd like to have kids, but I can't afford it because we can't have a home. These are massive social changes. And one of the impacts of it is that it's both a product of, and it accelerates, I think, this inclination to try the old failed idea that we can be an island and live on our own, be our own God, and not be connected to other people. And it isn't playing out very well, but it's certainly a very real thing, and it's happening.
Yeah, there's a lot in there to chew on. Maybe if we all just want to think about various different streams of that. The thought that came to my mind is, as young people are growing up, a lot of blame, I guess, is placed at the feet of older generations for the challenges that younger generations are facing. What's a way forward in the middle of that? I mean, you come from a world of developing policy in trying to make hard decisions that aren't going to please everyone, but are for the common good of our society. When you look at this generational polarity, let alone the political polarization and sort of the partisan politics that people play and the demonization of the other, is there a way back? Where are the moral resources to be able to work together on these problems to be found?
It's a good question, and I was, just talking a while ago on in another setting about subsidiarity. I was asked to talk about subsidiarity at the ARC conference in London, and when I first heard it, I thought, "What is that?" Then I had to learn how to pronounce it. But it's actually a very biblical doctrine. It comes from the Old Testament. It's the idea that you should accept responsibility for the things that are within your control and which can be best done by you, not by someone else. And that you'll work in community, including in family, to help others to resolve their issues, as they should then accept their responsibility to help you. You should not push up to the next level in society that which you can better do for yourself. Well, we've lost that concept. We've lost to the idea of God. And when you take God and a higher authority, if you like, out of the equation, what's the highest authority left? Government. So if I've got a problem and I'm no longer committed to trying to resolve my own issues to the extent that I should, I'm not accepting my responsibilities, I'm encouraged to believe in the modern narrative that I'm either a victim or a victim maker, an oppressor, but it's not my fault. I'm a victim of the circumstances is the common line. Well, if there's no God, who's the greatest authority to look to? It's government. And yet a proper understanding, I think, in our culture of government is to say secular governments doesn't mean freedom from God. It just means that it's separate to the divine in the classic sense of the word secular. We've taken it to mean freedom from God, but it didn't mean that at all. It just meant there's a divine realm and there's a secular world. They both have their part to play. They should both interact and inform one another properly. But we've now decided in our newly formed understanding of secularism that we're aggressively anti-God. He's not there. He's not over government. Therefore, government is God. And we expect things of it that it can't do. I mean, in a democracy, a government is made up of politicians. What are politicians? They're human beings. They can't provide you with the answers to life any more than your neighbor or your mother or your son or your daughter can. Uh, there are so many things now that we're not actively seeking out for ourselves. And we've fallen victim to this absolutely simplistic, misleading, cruel, and stupid idea that the world's divided into the oppressed and the oppressors. You can see it playing out now in the public reaction to what's happening with the terrorist organisation Hamas and Israel. The accusations made there that that Israel is an oppressor nation, and that somehow or other Hamas are now freedom fighters, not terrorists, and shouldn't be hauled to account. And that is plainly lacking in any understanding and any nuancing. To say it's a simple oppressor versus oppressed model is woefully inadequate and just leads you up all sorts of intellectual and moral and spiritual dry gullies.
So do you think this is where then the Christian story, which really has an emphasis on our common humanity, that all people everywhere are created in the image of God, and that puts this diagnosis that all of us have a degree of moral responsibility for the things that we've done, but also a promise of justice for the things that are done against us, and it places that back at God's feet. The resources of forgiveness that Jesus taught, to love even our enemies, to pray for those who persecute you, to bless and do not curse. Is this why you think maybe even secular thinkers are starting to be drawn towards the Christian story and maybe the roots that it played in Western civilization? Because it feels like we've lost some of those moral resources to move us forward.
Well, Dan, in two parts, I absolutely believe that each of us deep down need to set out on that journey of discovery, seeking the answers, because nobody else can do it for us. They can point the way. You can point the way. You do it extremely well. But if people are not willing to make that quest, to ask the hard questions, to go looking for meaning, I mean, we settle for second best. I actually want to be the person that I should be. I know I'm not, but I want to be the person I should be. And I want to be in proper relationship. And if there's a God there, I sure want to know about it. Because what if he happens to be a God who's righteous and will insist on justice? And when he examines my life, he's going to find it wanting. And if I'm honest with myself, I know I am very badly wanting. I'm not a saint. I'm not somebody who can say I am without need of forgiveness. I've hurt people. I've hurt and grieved God by my rejection of him. I believe that to be profoundly the case.
I mean, you're very honest. There's fallen, broken tendencies within all of us. None of us live up to who we wish we were or want to be at our best moments. Talk to me about your experience in politics, because I know a lot of young men, young people that are maybe getting into their careers or maybe even getting involved in politics. There's kind of this current or this stream that you get pulled into in these worlds where the person that you want to be, you kind of become a moral shadow of that person simply by the environment that you're a part of and the small choices that you make along the way. You pulled pin relatively early in your political career. You could have stayed for a lot longer than you did. You said you weren't enamored or drawn up to it. What was it that kept you from becoming a moral shadow of your former self through that whole experience, to keep your heart and your mind through all of that? Talk us through some wisdom on how young guys can navigate that.
The first point I'd make is that I have to say 2 decades didn't seem like an early end of the career. I was exhausted at the end of it.
Yeah.
I think a healthy dose of respect and awe, rightly understood, even fear of the righteousness of an almighty being, is very helpful. William Wilberforce, the great parliamentarian and reformer who spearheaded, many friends around him, I must never forget that, but who spearheaded the parliamentary effort to end slavery, said that he worked out his salvation in fear and trembling. So I always had a healthy fear of quite a few things. One of them was of letting the whole thing go to my head. I was helped there partly, if I'm really honest, by my father's absolute loathing of a lack of humility, of a lack of perspective in other people. He hated people who were full of themselves, and I grew up with that. I think he understood. He wasn't a believer, Dad, but I think he understood in a funny way C.S. Lewis's observation that pride lies at the heart of every human failing. So seek humility with all your heart and know the minute you think you're making progress, you're not. So that was useful. I think being in a set, I don't take great credit for this, but I'd certainly worked hard at it, of good, healthy relationships was very valuable.
Mm.
So having a wife who was very supportive, very strong, probably had an equally strong dislike of being of pomposity and pride, because that's a trap for politicians that my father had. That was useful. An absolute commitment to our children.
Mm.
They might find that hard to believe, but they always mattered more to me than, apart from my wife, than anything else. This is part and parcel of why I mentioned earlier again, there's nothing like having your own children to understand what it is to love your neighbour and be prepared to make sacrifices for them.
Mm.
And I think too, some, good friends, young men especially should take note of this. I say this all the time. The girls do it more instinctively anyway, I think. But young men especially, they need their mates, and they need to be, two or three people that they're very open with, that they can hold to account and be accountable to. And to maintain that even in politics was very important for me. But there was another little sheet anchor for our lives. I took seriously that I couldn't work 7 days a week. Sunday was for recreation. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Mm.
And the kids learned very early on. It was very interesting.
Yeah.
That Sunday was the day that they knew that they came absolutely number one, not just in the sense that they were valued above all else, so to speak, other people and timetables and commitments to meetings and rallies and all of those sorts of things, but also in the sense, a practical sense, that they could help us design the day, what we'd do for R&R after church and all of those sorts of things. Always began
So
with
good.
bacon and eggs. That was my great treat, Sunday morning, bacon and eggs.
Hey, that sounds like some of the greatest wisdom. Always make the claim that bacon has to be the greatest culinary argument for the existence of God. So it's always a good way to start the day. Can I talk about a particular experience you had in politics? So you were serving as deputy PM, and John Howard was overseas at the time of the September 11 attacks in 2001, meaning you kind of had to step in to the response to that scenario over in the USA. What was that experience like?
In many ways, it was the hardest week in public life. There are other very, very tough moments, but that was extraordinary and unprecedented and
Yeah.
pretty chilling, really. It had been a bad enough week before that happened, because Ansett Airlines, which was actually a New Zealand airline, people don't realise that, it wasn't Australian, but everyone thought of it as Australian, went into liquidation financially. And we had a nightmarish job trying to find ways to get Australians who were stranded by the fact that their flights home weren't there, sort all that out. We tried desperately to get the airline refinanced enough to let it fly on for a few more weeks so we could organise a sale, but it owed so much it was beyond belief. We couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I couldn't ask the taxpayers to stump up the hundreds of millions of dollars involved. And then 9/11 happened. It was an astonishingly powerful reminder that the West, in its complacency, and remember, it wasn't all that long after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and everyone thought democracy's won out, peace has won out, communism's had its day, and everybody will drift towards open, freer societies, and we'll all be more prosperous, and we can stop worrying about defence. So that was the mindset. That seems hard to believe now in a dangerous world, but that was the mindset at the time. And suddenly here's this powerful reminder that there are people with dastardly means and dastardly intent who absolutely loathe Western freedom, and to whom life is not precious. Either theirs, the people who flew the aeroplanes, or the people on the aeroplanes, or the people in the Twin Towers, and the other people who were meant to die in the Pentagon and the White House. Remember, there were 4 planes.
Yeah.
It was an extraordinary moment. And I remember saying, this is a powerful reminder that our culture needs to be aware that evil has not gone away. I remember the French foreign minister at the time saying, what is this American notion of good and evil? We sophisticated Europeans did away with such simplistic ideas decades ago.
Mm.
Well, he was talking from Paris. Had he forgotten that at that stage it was only about 45 years since Germans, with the help of some terrible French, by which I mean they were evil Frenchmen, just as there were good
Mm.
Frenchmen, rounded up Jews into the marshalling yards in Paris and exported them to the gas chambers? Was that not evil?
Mm.
But he was this powerful reminder that it hasn't gone away. It hadn't gone away. Now we have it all around us, and we can see it
Mm.
everywhere. And we're
No-
rightly frightened by it.
And I want to
Anyone
wrestle with
who's
that
not
theme
frightened
of,
by it is living in La La Land. The world has
yeah.
become a very chillingly concerning place. It should be sobering us no end.
Mhm. And there have been some big shifts even in the last 20 years. So when you stood down in 2005, that was almost at the point where the new atheist movement was ramping up. The rhetoric around the idea that God just doesn't not exist. There's no evidence for God. It's that there's no evidence for God and religion is evil and that it poisons everything. And so those spate of books from Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and Chris Hitchens really trying to promote this idea that look at what religion has done as a net negative force in society. We need to stamp it out with the elevation of reason and science and secular thinking. The brights are going to win the day. We've moved a long way from that height of new atheism in the late 2000s as well now, where you've got on your channel, and if we want to shift towards that a little bit, this conversation series over the last 5-6 years now, where you've had a lot of people who don't believe in God, or at least who aren't traditionally religious on the channel, and yet are openly now exploring these ideas of meaning and purpose and God and the ways that that makes sense of many of life's deepest questions and helps us deal with this reality of evil, and that maybe Christianity brought more to the fore. I'd love to chat about some of your experiences interviewing some of these secular thinkers. Have you got any standout sort of moments?
Oh, well, really quite a few, I suppose. And some of them aren't actually on the recordings, but they happened in the conversations before and afterwards.
Sure.
I don't think Tom Holland would mind me saying, for example, he wrote Dominion, and he's not a believer, but he basically says the very air we breathe, that's from another title, by the way, but, is basically Christian and we don't realize it. Our concern for the marginalized, for example, which plays out in funny ways now as people want to defend minorities all the time, sometimes to extraordinary degrees. But it has its genesis in the idea that all people matter. At the same time as we say Christianity is evil, we don't understand where that concept came from. You don't
Yeah.
find it in other religions. I mean, if you take Hinduism, you've got 300 million untouchables who are subhuman in the eyes of those who are not untouchables. Christianity won't have any truck with that whatsoever. It says the lowliest, most unfortunate, most degraded person still has the stamp of God on them and still has the option for redemption, a vastly different concept. So I don't think he'd mind me saying, I said to him in conversation after we'd recorded the video, that I personally thought one of the greatest challenges for the West in keeping democracy together was that we've lost sight of the idea that all matter. Every individual has worth and dignity, and that stands behind the ideas of the vote in itself, behind common law, everyone's subject to the same law of the land, whether you're the king or the most humble peasant, so on and so forth. And he said, I agree with you. That is the greatest challenge of all. If you strip out a transcendent reason for saying everyone has value and worth and dignity, what other rational basis is there for saying it? Because the atheist's usual answer, and this is where many of them are starting to see it comes unstuck, is to say, oh, well, we're different because human beings have a moral sense. Well, you're in trouble straight away. Because the minute you adopt that policy, you're confronted with the reality that you find many people's morality inferior to your own. We're pretty proud about these things. So therefore, they're inferior people. And it all comes unstuck. I mean, if you listen to Douglas Murray, who says he's an atheist, he will openly say that the abandonment of a Christian worldview is immensely damaging. And he will contrast the founder of Christianity very favorably with the founders of other beliefs. You can go online and find that. The last conversation I did with him, he did it to enormous effect. And so it goes on. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that there is a recognition amongst thinking people that perhaps Nietzsche was right. If God is dead, maybe man is as well. We can't be our own God. It doesn't make sense. All that is left, once you abandon the idea of a transcendent being, once you abandon the idea of and the pursuit of truth, you lose the ability to use truth to speak to power.
Mm.
And you have to resort to trying to build power to speak to power.
Yeah.
And we've seen how ugly that is because we're reducing our public life. We see it all the time and we're disgusted by it. It's all about power plays rather than about serving. It's not about principle. It's about lording it over others. And we
Mm.
see it and we see how ugly it is. And I think it would be fair to say that that is what a lot of deep thinkers who have called themselves atheists are starting to become concerned by. And I don't think I'm
Mm.
putting words in Richard Dawkins' mouth. I understand he recently made the observation that he thought if we got rid of Christianity, you'd have sanity. Now we seem to be believing all sorts of weird and wonderful and destructive things and
Mhm.
visiting great division on our society as we argue over them. Hello? G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis both made utterances to the effect of, don't think when you stop believing in God, you'll enter some wonderful nirvana where we don't believe in anything and everything works out well. In reality, what will happen is we believe in anything. And that's what's
Mm.
happening. We're believing in anything. We've become unbelievably gullible. I can't believe what some intelligent people believe or say they
What do
believe in.
you, yeah, what do you make of then, let's say, the recent coming out of someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has been a figurehead, sort of secular thinker and atheist for much of her life, and has been involved in conversations at atheist conferences and shared the stage with Richard Dawkins on multiple occasions to that end, but who's now come out as a Christian. And sort of part of the key concern has been this move of civilization, that the Christian faith, the teachings of Jesus, if true, are a real bulwark against darker, more sinister ideologies. And so she's really drawn then towards the Christian way of seeing things. What do you make of those sort of seeming conversion stories that are based more on the outcomes of religious belief? Yeah, any take on that?
Yeah, a lot. The first thing I'd say is I respect her absolutely hugely and wouldn't want to put any words in her mouth. So I don't want to sound
Mm.
presumptuous. But I think the first thing I would say is, now help me, Dan, it was Socrates, I think, wasn't it? The life, a life, an unreflective life is not worth living.
Yeah, that's it.
If you're not thinking through the events of your own life as it's unfolding around you, asking the big questions, asking what does it mean, how do I make sense of it, I'll let Socrates just make the point again. An unreflected life is not worth living. It's really important. It matters.
Mm.
Why would you want to be locked into pain and suffering and emptiness and loneliness, which are the features of modern life, without looking for answers? Why would you not be
Mm.
challenged when you join up the dots and look where Western culture's gone as it's deserted its core beliefs? Look where it's gone. Nobody says it was perfect because human beings aren't perfect. But is anybody really suggesting where we're at now is a healthy place?
Mm.
And the other thing that I think I would say is that she's not alone. There are many people moving into that category. See, atheism's not new. And atheism in the 19th century, particularly following the publication of the origin of the species, where people tried to develop sociological theories out of the scientific idea of evolution. And there were a lot of them. The cruelest of them, of course, was Nazism, the final solution. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. That's where a lot of that thinking came from, the survival of the fittest. It led to the evils of the Second World War, Hitler believing that the Aryan race was superior,
Mm.
that the Jews were the source of all evil in the world, and the destruction that followed from that form of the rejection of Christian truth, if you like, in Germany, which was nominally a Christian country, was horrendous. And you've got to think these things through. What do they
Mm.
mean? What do they teach us? How do we make sense of it? Otherwise, it is all pointless. It is all just a cosmic nightmare. There's no answer. So just hope you avoid the worst of the suffering, and you think that to yourself in your misery of your everyday life. I know I'm sounding a bit tough there, but those attempts to say, well, the survival of the fittest were to play out so badly. People often say one of the extraordinary things about Hitler was that he didn't know when to withdraw. So he left his troops dying in the tens of thousands in the freezing cold in Russia, and wouldn't accept the advice of his commanders to withdraw. His view was, well, we're meant to be the superior people. We're the master race. If we're not good enough to survive, well, we ought to be wiped out. We're not the master race. We're not the strongest that should pull through. How ugly is that? Doesn't it demand that we stop and we think again? So there's nothing new about the new atheists. These are all these arguments are essentially a rerun of what started to happen in the latter part of the 19th century, particularly in Britain and I would say in Germany, but elsewhere as well. We've seen their fruits.
And I do wonder if some of the optimism.
Sorry?
Yeah, sorry. You go.
No. We've seen the fruits.
I was going to say, we have seen the fruits. And I do wonder if some of the optimism then of atheism has really been given a road test. Does it deal with the existential longings, desires, sufferings, and struggles of human nature? And as much as we don't want anyone to be applying Darwinian ethics, I mean, even Richard Dawkins would say Darwinian evolution may be how we got here, but we don't want to apply Darwinian ethics as to where we go from here. But I think more around how someone like Jordan Peterson, let's say, as a clinical psychologist, has a therapeutic currency in that what he's trying to offer is answers not just to the big civilizational questions which we've discussed thus far, but zooming in then to the individual person. How do you make it through life? What is a story that's going to help you find purpose? What is the kinds of web of relationships and things that you do that's going to help you find ongoing meaning? What is going to be able to survive the suffering that you experience? And I think it's why people watching him flirt with sort of the Christian story has just given them pause to think, I dismissed Christianity because I was told it was idiotic to believe in a sky fairy or anything like this, but maybe there's more wisdom here. Maybe there's something deeper than what I imagined. Is that the same kind of tone you're picking up with many of the secular thinkers that you've interviewed on your podcast?
I think that is probably a fair assumption. I really do. So Jordan Peterson certainly reached the point where he says that the Bible is the answer to truth. You can't find truth without it. He has opened up a conversation that's given space for people to explore these things. But I do think I think we've moved into an environment where leading thinkers are acknowledging that the loss of a sense of the transcendence is not playing out well. The question then becomes, where do you take it? How do you follow it through to its logical end? How do you ensure that you actually land the plane? And for me, that does require us grappling with the question of who is the central figure in history. Plainly, that's Jesus Christ. You can't deny that. I mean, it's just idiocy to say he didn't exist. He plainly did. It's idiocy to say, I think, that he wasn't influential. He plainly was. It's also true to say that overwhelmingly his teachings have been recognized for their wisdom and for their insights and for the positive benefits that have flowed more broadly to societies when those words are taken seriously. When they've been distorted or not taken seriously, people have done dreadful things, no doubt about that. But when, think of the great heroes of the faith. I mean, would an atheist really say that William Wilberforce was wrong to have devoted his entire parliamentary life to the abolition of slavery and the reform of the way the British behaved in India and to the ending of corruption in the English Parliament? Well, the next question is, what made this man who inherited a fortune and was seen as the glittering political figure who would one be prime minister, give it all up in pursuit of freedom for people who were seen as subhumans, black African slaves? But he did. What drove all of that? Well, it was a profound conversional experience. How can you walk away from the impact it had on him? You know, you can't. So what's my point? My point is that I think properly understood, the witness of transformational Christianity and the impact it's had on individuals and where it's been properly understood and carried forward in societies suggests that there is absolute gold in that Christian story of a God
Mm,
who intervenes and offers
mm.
us salvation out of sacrificial love. And you know that story and you explain it better or as well as anybody I know, Dan.
Mm.
So uh, over to
That's very
you on
kind of
that
you.
one.
That's very kind of you. There's one more person that I want to ask you about actually that you've had on your channel. It's someone that I actually wrote a couple of papers to. I did some emails back and forth with him. He very kindly responded. But it's Jonathan Haidt, who is a moral psychologist, teaches over at New York University. He has just this brilliant insight in terms of his statistical research around how people form moral and religious and political beliefs. But as a result of his research, despite his own political leanings, has become a huge advocate for the necessity of free public speech. And I'd love just to get any insights that you've really appreciated from that conversation that you had with him, and why you do your podcast in terms of exposing people to different points of view. What do you think is the role then of freedom of speech in a healthy, functioning democracy?
Oh, it's vital. And I think Janet Albrechtsen was right when she said it's the freedom by which we defend all other freedoms. But there is a sense in which I'd say freedom is in a Western culture is a four-legged stool. And bear with me for a moment. So freedom of conscience and belief, which we really learnt when we stopped burning people at the stake for dissenting. You know,
Mm,
it's just barbaric, it's unchristian, it's stupid because today's minority will be tomorrow's majority and you end up burnt at the stake. So we recognise we needed to live in harmonies. I think it's the genius behind Western harmony, that we have to live with one another's deepest differences. And now we're losing that ability. Freedom to speak your mind and to hear others, as John Stuart Mill put it. If you don't know the opposing point of view, no matter how passionately you hold your own, it's not of much value. And I would just say it's very interesting to see how quickly most people's arguments fall apart if you ask the right questions.
yes.
I hate to say it, but it's true. And so in this age now of feelings, I feel, therefore I am. Very often what will happen, and here's a direct challenge to young people who deploy this methodology, because I've seen it and I've seen it too often, and it's very, very demeaning to the person who does it. They'll just say, we're not going to talk about it anymore. They just shut it down. That's incredible, you know, to so silence voices that you won't hear a diversity of views and have your own challenged. It means you're not sure you're right. So you're just going to say, don't offend me because that's the greatest sin of all. We're going to
Mm,
shut it down before you do offend me. That is an absolute cop out. Don't do it.
mm.
You know, it may cost you everything. Freedom of association is critical. You can't have freedom of speech if you don't have freedom of association. This is the extraordinary thing about the push from progressives, including the Greens and political parties in Australia, to force schools and charities and so forth to take people on regardless of their personal views. When those same Green members and senators and what have you would never take someone into their office who didn't agree with them. You know, discrimination's not always a bad thing. It can be an absolute key to freedom of speech and the promotion of ideas and the public contest around what's good policy and bad policy. Let me illustrate another
Yeah.
way. When I was Deputy PM, I didn't take somebody into my office who was absolutely opposed to everything I stood for. I wasn't obliged to, and I didn't do it. I gathered around me a team. I didn't want yes people. I didn't want that at all. I think my staff, many of whom I've remained good friends with, and they're all good friends with one another, would say, I did let them push back. I did let them say, I think we've got this wrong, boss, you know. But I didn't take somebody on who was, for example, absolutely opposed to my modelling and my mind as to what was going to advance the people's interests economically or in terms of rural policy or what have you. I mean, the hypocrisy of it is
Yeah.
breathtaking.
Wouldn't make
Freedom of
sense.
association is important. And property rights. We forget that one. Your property right, your ability to earn a living by producing and selling goods or trading your intellect, your communication skills, your hard work, those property rights, if they're destructed, I mean, two of the 10 commandments mention property rights. They're critical to freedom. You can't
Mm,
have freedom without the right to sell your specialized products or abilities.
mm,
So it's a multi-stooled, legged stool, and in abandoning them, because all four are under attack in our culture, we actually risk the freedoms that our forefathers have worked so hard to
mm.
develop for us and to then defend in times of conflict.
It's one of the things I appreciate about Jonathan Haidt's push with the Heterodox Academy is to actually give a score on educational institutions as to how well they have viewpoint diversity.
Yes.
So whether or not you receive a quality education is based on whether you get to hear opposing points of view, work through the arguments, and then form meaningful convictions that isn't just groupthink. Do you feel like there needs to be
Just
some
on
kind of
that, look, he's a
reform?
wonderful man, a wonderful researcher. He's terrific company. I don't think I'm misrepresenting him when I say that, so far as I know, he remains an atheist, but he's a very, very honest one and a brilliant researcher. And his research into the damage we're doing to our children, particularly since smartphones became common in about 2011, 2012, massive. So
Mm,
kids get phone time instead of playtime. And his research suggests that it drives the boys towards obsessions with gaming, and the girls are damaged because it leads them to compare themselves unfavorably with others. And the great problem for both groupings is that they don't mix.
mm,
So he says, don't give them smartphones until they're well into their teenage years. Give them flip phones so they can text one another and say, yeah, let's go and meet down in the mall or the park and we'll kick a football around, rather than just sitting on the screens
mm.
communicating.
Yeah,
So that's doing
it's the
immense
dumb
damage. Now,
phone.
Here's the rub. If you go on and listen to his a presentation to ARC in London, and remember, no one questions the integrity of this man's research. He says our kids are in crisis, and the only ones that are doing well are those who are growing up in families that are faithful, have a faith, background, and are deeply engaged in their children and their well-being, and are adopting a conservative attitude towards uh, modern technologies. Now,
Mm,
for him to say that, there's a classic example of somebody who's following the evidence, not just going where they want to think. And
mm,
and as a man who he I don't think, again, I think he'd mind me saying this, he said, I was quite well advanced in years before I realized how decent conservative people, because I wasn't a conservative, can be, and how often they actually have a broader moral palette than people from the left, because the left
mm,
always parades its moral superiority. So when you research it, it's actually not like that at all. Often you'll find people of a more conservative predisposition have a broader moral palette and a broader
mm,
understanding. So, for example, the left will often say the police are evil, um, and the right will say, well, because they oppose demonstrations or something like that. Whereas the right will say, oh, but stop and think about the little old ladies who desperately need police protection
mm.
if they're threatened. That's probably,
Just an
anyway. You can
ability to
look up.
take more concept in.
You can look
Yeah,
it
his
all
book,
up.
The Righteous
He's very
Mind.
public in his writings, and he's
Yeah,
saying that without a broader engagement in a diversity of views on American campuses, um, our culture is in deep trouble, and you've seen it
yeah.
now, and of course, with the three leading American universities, where they've made such a hash of their commitment to freedom and diversity viewpoint on their campuses that one of them's had to resign, and a couple of the others have massively disgraced themselves and their universities, and the American people are deeply shocked by it, as they ought to be.
Mm,
And we ought to be pretty worried about what's happening in ours.
yeah. Yeah, I certainly hope moving forward that civics will become a bigger thing. I mean, I think it's been a sad loss that universities mostly now are just sort of professional colleges, in the sense that you're training very narrowly for a particular set of skills for your future work. And we've lost that liberal arts angle of developing the soulishness of who we are with history and philosophy and civics. And maybe more of that can be fed back into the schooling system in the years to come. And we realize the shortfall in our development. But John, just wanted to actually just finish out this interview with a few questions from a quick fire round, just things that people get a better sense of where you're coming from and who you are and some of your own experiences. So I'll kick these off. You have to do a sub 1 minute answer. That's the challenge. So what was your most powerful experience of God personally?
The night as a 16-year-old when my commerce teacher explained the gospel to me, that was unbelievably powerful. I just walked out there, and I've never really, not for a moment, really doubted the existence of God, nor the saving grace of Jesus Christ since.
Your whole life then, what's been the most compelling reason why you believe in God?
Personal experience of grace is, and a very close second, frankly, is the mess that descends on us when we reject God individually and corporately.
It's really insightful.
It points me to the reality. There has to be a better way.
Mm. What do you think is the most legitimate or compelling argument against Christianity?
The most compelling, I think, would be the question of blind suffering. By that I mean, and there's a distinction. Most human suffering is a result of human beings behaving badly. They have the right to choose good or bad, and they choose bad. But then something like the tsunami presents me with a very big problem, and I can only plead, well, I don't believe this is the way it's meant to be, and I one day believe it will all end and the wounds will be bound up. But I think that's, I do think that's hard. The popular and trite reasons that are often given, can't see him, he doesn't seem to be there when I reach out and so forth, I don't find very compelling. I find them sad rather than compelling.
Yeah. What do you wish newcomers knew about Christianity?
That it will cost you nothing, but it'll cost you everything. That's the truth of it. But that gold, it really is worth selling everything so that you can have it, that pearl. Because I profoundly believe that our 70, our life on earth, is short and hard. And I want to believe that the pain will end and that joy will be complete. And I profoundly believe that that is the intention. That is the option that's before us. All we have to do is claim it.
And if you could give your 18-year-old self one piece of advice, John, what would that be?
God won't let you down, even when it looks like he is letting you down. As I look back over, he doesn't. So have faith and press on.
Yeah. Well, mate, I so appreciate all the wisdom, just being able to pick your mind on various experiences you've had across your life story, and really honored with the role that you're playing in so many people's lives of now wanting to turn around and mentor and encourage and really support future generations as they're navigating the problems both of faith, but of public life, and of how to engage politically in a way that really does leave an indelible mark for the gospel on our world. So appreciate the role that you play there. If you had a parting message to anyone who's maybe curious or just investigating and considering Christianity, what would that parting message be?
Oh, well, it would be, and I mean this very sincerely, I know of the work that you and David Dean do at CQ. Seek out a conversation if you're listening to this with Dan or with David, and you'll find that they are absolutely interested in and committed to you and your journey, and I think can help you work through the issues.
I think it's a gift of people who know Jesus, certainly want to play that sort of supportive role. And so I appreciate that, mate. Well, John, we're going to make sure that we put all the links to your website and particularly to your YouTube channel and podcast in the show notes so that people can connect in there. As we said before, there's now over 500,000 subscribers to your channel, because what you're doing, it just does seem to add a lot of value, being able to explore these big ideas that are shaping our world. So I just want to say thank you to you and really appreciate you coming on the channel.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you.
See you, mate. Wow, it's a big deal to make it to the end of the episode. I want to say a huge thanks to everyone who watches the channel. And if you can comment below, like and subscribe, and share with anyone that might be helpful, it really does help get what we do out through the algorithms. If you want to send in your own questions, you can find us at questioningchristianity.com. Or if you want to connect with the infographics and other content that we do across our social media platforms, our handle is @QC Socials. Go and follow along. But until next time, with our future episodes, truth invites questioning, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks. Bye.